Mr. Larry Krasner, thank you so much for joining us today. You had a big announcement earlier this afternoon about probation and parole violations in Philadelphia. Can you give us just a rundown of some of the new guidelines that you unveiled today?
Sure. So it's a big goal of our administration to cut back on the enormous number of people who are being supervised on probation and parole for a number of reasons. Just by way of reference, Philly has 40,000 people. New York, which is 5 or 6 times as big, has 12,700. And that pattern repeats all over the country. Philadelphia is ridiculously over-supervised, which wouldn't matter if it didn't do bad things, but it does bad things. When people are supervised for too long, they tend to fail, they go back to jail, they lose their jobs, they commit new crimes, and we don't need more crimes. We need fewer crimes. So it's a big goal of this administration, not only to reduce mass incarceration, which we are doing and have done effectively, but also to reduce mass supervision for all the reasons I said, but also because it drives mass incarceration.
And before we get more into what the guidelines are, can you define the guidelines first of all, and then we'll get into a little bit more of what that might mean for people.
Sure. What we have done here is we're giving guidance. In fact, in about an hour, I'm going to do a training for all of our attorney staff on how we should be negotiated guilty pleas and resolutions of cases, and what kinds of recommendations we should be making to judges. And the bottom line is we need to shorten these periods of supervision. Let me just give you an example, because this used to go on all the time. Someone is involved in a case, not that serious, is given a sentence of 3 to 23 months in jail, plus 2 years of supervision on probation after that. What are we really talking about? We're talking about being in jail for 3 months, and then being on parole for 20 months, and then being on probation after that for 24 months, 3 months in, 44 months under supervision. You're talking about supervising at a rate of 15 to 1. And that is how Pennsylvania got to be the state in the United States that has the largest number, that has has the worst level of excessive parole, and it's the second worst level of supervision, meaning the combination of probation and parole.
Right behind Georgia.
Right behind Georgia, but Georgia has changed its laws. So if we don't do something about this in a couple years, Pennsylvania will actually be the worst of all 50 states. And frankly, I don't think that's how we think about ourselves or how we should think about ourselves. It's just the truth.
And you've mentioned the words mass supervision a couple times discussing this. Can you define that for the average person?
Sure. Go walk out on the street right now, and you will find out that among adults, 1 out of every 22 people in Philadelphia is supervised. 1 out of every 22 people. To me, that's just stunning. It's certainly not how we like to think of the land of freedom or the city where, all these wonderful documents of freedom began. But that's the truth. We have a city where the level of supervision is overwhelming. And like I said, who would care if it wasn't that it actually does damage and it causes crime, but it causes crime.
So let's break that number down. 1 out of 22?
Adults.
Adults. And is that men and women, mostly men?
It is men and women. It's overwhelmingly men, but yes.
And what do we see that doing in these communities?
So let me give you the example of someone who comes out of jail, and they probably should have had supervision for maybe 2 years, because a lot of times the first year does some good, but instead they had supervision for 6 years. So this young person is doing very well as a landscaper and says, boss, I got to go see my PO. It's my bi-weekly visit to the PO. I got to go today. And the boss says, no, you don't. I've been putting up with this for years. You're a great employee. God knows I love you, but other people called out sick. I got to make payroll. We got a new job to start tomorrow. I can't let you go. You can't go today. So what is this person to do? Having reunited with family, making their own way, being a provider, you can either not go and see your PO, in which case you'll be back in front of a judge with a strong possibility of going to jail, or what you can do is you can lose your job, which is one of the main things that's keeping you away from whatever got you in trouble before. And when you lose your job, then you can't pay your supervision fee to probation, which could be a violation. You can't pay your fines and costs to probation, which could be a violation. You may have difficulty affording travel to go visit. It becomes a catch-22 for the first year especially, and then to some extent the second and third. We're doing good here. But when you get past 3 years, what we're doing is setting a bunch of tripwires up that only make things worse, and we can't do that.
Right, and the second, third years, I know that comes from research, but what does the research say happens at year 2, year 3, and obviously beyond, because we're sometimes talking decades?
So what the research says, and needless to say, these are big trends. It doesn't apply to every case to the same measure. Some of these cases are very minor offenses. Some of them are much more serious offenses. But what it says is there's a good amount of benefit for a lot of people in the first year, significantly less in the second of supervision. diminishing returns in the third, but then after 3 years, it is not merely neutral. It's not merely ineffective. It actually causes people to fail on probation and parole. It causes them to go back to jail, causes them to lose their jobs, separate from their families, and go back towards what they call criminogenic behavior, meaning it pushes them back towards crime. That's what it does. I mean, let's be honest. You put me, on 10 years of supervision, where I cannot miss this, and I must pay that, and I must pay the other thing, et cetera, et cetera. It's just a bunch of tripwires I have to dance over for all those years, and some people can. But far too many people with good intentions doing the best to get their lives together are not going to be able to do it, and we need that money for other things like public schools.
So historically, what has been the purpose of probation or supervision, I should say, and what do you want that purpose to be moving forward?
Well, I don't think there's a real change in how we all see what the purpose should be. The purpose should be to do the things that are going to prevent crime in the future, that are going to keep the public safe. Preventing crime in the future often means addressing the issues that brought the supervised person into the criminal justice system in the first place. So it may be addiction, it may be mental illness, it may be really bad decisions made in your youth, things of that sort. It is a combination of enforcement and rehabilitation that's appropriate to trying to prevent crimes in the future. We don't disagree about any of that, and frankly, none of this policy goes to changing the period in jail. That's what we decide first before we get to part two, which is at the period of supervision, according to science, according to studies that are legitimate, should be reduced.
Is there nothing in state law that requires a certain amount of time for supervision?
There is, and that's actually one of Pennsylvania's problems. We have state law that says that your supervision must be at least as long as the period of time we're sending you to jail for, okay? So if we want to send you to jail for 1 year, in many states we could just say you're going to jail for 1 year. And when you come out, there's no supervision, or we can add on a little bit of supervision. In Pennsylvania, we don't have that ability. In Pennsylvania, we have to say you're going to jail for 1 to 2 years. And the 1 year will be in, and then if you do okay, you'll be paroled, and you will have that period of parole. But the culture that grew up around that was that we weren't just satisfied with 1 to 2. Often it became 1 to 5. So you'd be paroled after 1 year, you'd have 4 years of parole, and then we would tack probation on the end of that. So you might be sentenced to 1 to 5 years, plus another 5 years of supervision, 1 year in jail, 9 years of supervision, and the results speak for themselves. It does not make us safer. It does not make our city proper. It creates a whole group of people who are basically unemployable, because most employers don't want anybody on probation and parole. They don't want to invest in training them to do the job, knowing that if there's a violation, they could go away. So it's a mess, and it's something we can fix.
So does this create any sort of tension then between the city and the state?
Well, I would say there has been a persistent tension between the city and the state. The state likes not to fund our students in Philadelphia. The state likes not to give us money. The state likes Donald Trump, and Philly don't. I mean, let's get real. That's what's going on. It is a tension because a lot of the upstate counties profit from putting Philadelphians in their jails. They like mass incarceration, and if mass supervision gives them mass incarceration, bring it on. Yeah, I mean, this is the reality of modern America. There is tension right now between rural communities and cities. Hopefully that will change. But I don't think there's anywhere where it's more pronounced than in Pennsylvania, where you have this enormous difference between Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and an awful lot of the counties in between.
Is that going to, we talked about friction, but will there be any legal ramifications if Philadelphia is doing one thing, other counties are doing something else? No,
because it is squarely within the lane of the prosecutor's office to make recommendations in relation to sentencing. Everything we're doing is completely legal. It's just a culture shift to not try to get the longest possible supervision. It's what people have done for a long time. A lot of things in Pennsylvania are just not normal. They feel normal. For example, Pennsylvania had more juvenile lifers than any other state in the United States, which meant more than any country in the world. Philadelphia was the biggest one-city generator of juvenile lifers in the United States. To us, that somehow seemed normal, but it's not normal, and we know that simply by looking at national standards.
So I'm glad you mentioned juveniles, because I was going to ask if these policies might trickle down to juveniles at any point. I know you have a new person in office, Bob Listenby, who is in charge of these reforms. Is this on his plate? Is this something he's thinking about?
You know, Bob, who was President Obama's chief of juvenile criminal justice for quite some time, has done an amazing job in our office and introduced pretty sweeping reforms of juvenile justice several months ago. It does relate to this because, you know, what we find is a lot of things done in juvenile justice, such as sending kids away to basically a home at $160,000 a year, or sending them away to a juvenile jail at more than $220,000 a year, had problems. People came out, the education was unacceptable, they were unable to get high school degrees after they came out, recidivism was high. So there are a lot of things in juvenile justice that need to be changed. Kids need to be closer to home, and the supervision needs to be appropriate. But there are wrinkles in that system that are quite different than the adult system.
Sure.
So these exact policies don't apply in the same way.
Might they, or is that not?
No, they might
possible?
not, but you know, the same principles can be instituted in juvenile, meaning that this emphasis on limiting supervision for those people who don't need it anymore is something we can pursue.
And you mentioned a culture shift in just in terms of criminal justice. I mean, that seems like that's going to take a lot of time. And I'm curious if some of the criticism that you've been hearing about your office is because you're really ultimately talking about a long-term solution, and people like to see short-term solutions.
Sure.
How do you balance those two things?
Well, that's a great point. I mean, the reality is when we look at this issue, right, there are 37 other states, 37 out of 50 states, where supervision is decreasing, and decreasing a lot. Many of them have passed laws that make it impossible to have old levels of supervision, and yet Pennsylvania is over here on, you know, the caboose on this train. So I don't actually agree it's going to take that long for these reforms to come, because they've already come in so many other places. Pennsylvania just has to catch up. I think we can do a lot, but what you are describing, which is that we're taking a lot of criticism, you know, that's to be expected. The reality is, in any social movement that is seeking change in a nonviolent way, we have the record, we've read the history. It's real simple. At first, they frankly take you for granted, and then they laugh at you, and then comes a time when they fight their fighting. Right now, they can see that we are gaining in our efforts to reduce incarceration. Crime is not going up, violent crime is coming down. They're seeing that we're coming with serious policies to reduce other things, and for some of them, it affects their wallet. You know, they'd like plenty of people in jail because they can make money off of it. I mean, it wasn't so long ago an upstate legislator tried to pass a law that said you can't close any jails in Pennsylvania without a one-year study. Really? Guess why? Well, it is because they were seeing they weren't getting this steady supply of Philadelphians to lock up in their jail cells for long times from which they could profit. So we're going to come up against that, but that's a good sign. That means we're getting stuff done. That means people who are opposed to this are fighting back because they know that we are on the road to where we need to go.
Having said that, did you reach out to any other elected officials or lawmakers in the state, or anybody in the supervision community before unrolling these reforms, you know, interested in getting their feedback to see how they might react to this?
We have, well, the answer is yes and no. I mean, first of all, there are many aspects to this problem, and we have been engaging with people in the courts and outside of the courts for quite some time in terms of other aspects of the problem. But this is an internal policy. This is just a question of what my office is going to say to our ADAs and what we're going to recommend to judges. And in that sense, we focused more on research. We focused more on experts, like Vinny Schiraldi is a national expert, the former chief probation officer of New York City, who has a lot to say about this. We engaged him at length, and we did this for months. I mean, our efforts to do this go back to at least summer of last year. It has been a very carefully vetted thing. But you know, ultimately, this is not a consensus decision. This is a decision, like many decisions in the DA's office, that has to be made according to science. It's got to be made according to fact and according to your philosophy. And our philosophy is just different. We think that these kinds of things have to change. We want our city to be safer. And if reducing the number of people on supervision makes us safer, that's what we're going to do.
And just last question. This is, you're going into your second year. Mm-hmm. You have second, third coming up.
15 months in.
Yeah, what are you looking forward towards?
Well, I'm looking forward to more progress. I think this is a very, very serious and important goal this year. There's another aspect to it, and we'll probably be talking more about that in a couple of weeks, which is going to be to look back at the people already on probation and parole supervision who've done so well that perhaps they can have their supervision terminated early, which is legally permitted. It's been done for a very long time. But we're talking about doing it in a sweeping way. We're talking about looking at big numbers of people, working with the public defender's office and working with other stakeholders so that we can try in a really big way to cut the rolls by thousands, hopefully a lot of thousands, to get us down to another level. I think that's one of the things we're doing. We also have a real emphasis this year on the improvement of forensics in our investigations. We just were involved with a state trooper in solving a 31-year-old homicide. We arrested the gentleman who's charged with that case, and we brought him back up from the south, and he'll be standing trial for something that happened 31 years ago. We're going to endeavor with City Council to get a lot more money so that we can do DNA, because there are a lot of cases, including cold cases, where we think we can make a real difference when it comes to solving cold cases with adequate information and DNA. And we're going to have a very, very exciting announcement in the same vein in terms of using forensics and closing cold cases in relation to sexual assault cases coming up, cases in some events that may not have been solved in more than 20 years, coming up in the near future. So that is a real priority for us, is to try to do justice moving forward, but also do it moving backwards. Catch the guilty if they weren't caught before, but also make sure that the people who were found guilty are in fact guilty.
Well, thank you for the story ideas coming up. I look forward to speaking with you more about that. District Attorney Larry Krasner, thank you for joining us today.
Always great to see you, Alicia.